Welcome to the final part of our lesson on women and the Great Depression. Let's continue. Job loss struck at the very core of a man's sense of social identity, which was partly defined by his success as a provider, the basis of his authority within the home. Unemployment affected who they were as people, not just who they were as workers. One woman who worked in the relief office remembered, "Men came in, swallowed their pride, and signed away their manhood when they signed up for relief." The editor of a 1930s Canadian Journal of Social Work wrote, "The nation is imperiled. Its honor is at stake, when the father's wage must be supplanted by that of the wife and the children. There is something radically wrong which must be put right." As the letter written to Prime Minister Bennett suggested, married women's employment was perceived as fundamentally selfish in a period when thousands of capable men roamed the streets, unable to provide for their hungry families. Working wives were accused of snatching the bread out of the mouths of starving children, forcing men onto relief, and driving young single girls into sex work. A recurring theme was the notion of wives' incomes being put towards needless luxuries, frills, flaunted shamelessly in the gaunt faces of the truly needy. Opponents of working wives kept a sharp eye out for obvious signs of opulence. A Toronto woman wrote the newspaper, the Toronto Star, to say that she was so upset to overhear a saleswoman conversing on the phone with her maid about preparations for a fancy dinner party that she couldn't continue her shopping. Other letters spread gossip that told of couples driving to work in large cars, or the radios, electrical appliances, and fur coats assumed to eat up the second unnecessary salary. It's difficult to know exactly what the status of two income earning households were, but there's certainly evidence, like tax records, to suggest that these fears were overblown. In 1930, Chatelaine magazine conducted a survey of 300 working women, both single and married, asking them simply, "Why are you working?" The answers revealed economic need was paramount, and I'd like you to write down the results. 35% said they were working to support themselves. 28% were working to support others, with only 8% responding to live comfortably. 35% said they were working to support themselves. 28% were working to support others, with only 8% responding to live comfortably. This suspicion directed towards working women, especially working married women, lays bare society's deeply rooted ambivalence about women's presence in the public sphere of paid employment. We should talk about all the other women who, like men, lost their jobs. Women weren't often found in bread lines or hanging around relief offices, mainly because so many of them weren't eligible for even these tiny bits of social welfare. Married women were eligible for relief in most, but not all cases, provided there was no one else in the house currently working. Single women were ineligible on the grounds that they should be supported by their father's income. Care for single, independent women was taken up by private charity organizations and women's groups, like the National Council of Women or the Young Women's Christian Association, which were both able to provide women with material aid, such as food and clothing. Charity organizations also ran projects like employment bureaus, primarily to help unemployed women work as servants for the well to do. Another innovation was the public sewing room, where women could sew garments for their own families or to sell to other families. I noted already that there was nothing directed at unemployed women on the scale of relief camps, and while they were hardly a humane solution, it's interesting the government was so completely indifferent to the plight of unemployed women. It should be noted that there was nothing inevitable about the exclusion of women from relief efforts. For instance, in the US, the government response to the Great Depression was in many ways more humane than in Canada, which in itself is an interesting reversal of stereotypes of social policy within these two countries. In 1932, Democratic leader President Franklin Roosevelt won a landslide victory on the promise of a New Deal for Americans. His objectives were relief, recovery, and reform. Please be sure to watch the link entitled Relief, Recovery, and Reform on your PowerPoint slide. The New Deal included some social welfare and employment schemes, as well as projects specifically geared for women, often in the arts, health and recreation, and library services. Frances Perkins became the first woman to serve in the president's cabinet, and I also recommend that you watch that link. She was appointed Secretary of Labor. Thousands of women were appointed to jobs in the government, many running New Deal programs such as the Federal Theater Project led by Hallie Flanagan, and you can make up your mind if you want to watch that link. Ellen Woodward ran the Women's Division of the Works Progress Administration, which at its height in February of 1936 provided work for over 400,000 women. Now, many give credit for these policies to the lobbying efforts of Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, who had feminist leanings, and the work of many reform-minded women who held key positions in the US government at this time. And there is a short biographical clip on Eleanor Roosevelt. If you're interested in doing her as part of your historical moment, then feel free to watch that clip. Unfortunately, there was no such tradition in Canada. Many of the most powerful women in politics were also the most conservative. Charlotte Whitton, pictured here, was the very influential mayor of Ottawa and an important advocate of child welfare reforms. Here there's a link to an interview with her in 1972, but you can skip it if you don't have time. She was a complex character. She was anti-Semitic and very right-wing in her politics. She was opposed to the employment of married women on the grounds that their children would suffer. Why she thought poverty was a better solution is unclear. Another recommendation was the 1937 National Home Improvement Plan. It invited average families to take out low-interest loans to modernize their homes. The aim was to kickstart the construction industry to create a kind of domino effect in other areas of business. It's interesting that when the government finally decided to offer financial aid, it gave the actual money to people who wanted to renovate their homes, not to people who were having trouble paying rent in the first place. Applicants had to demonstrate their moral worth, defined in terms of financial stability and marital status. The objective was to weed out unmarried and transient workers from stable and responsible breadwinners. The plan was also clearly directed to men, to quote, Mr. Homeowner and his wife. So the money went to men, and the jobs created were all in male-dominated industries. And women? They got the fun of deciding how to decorate their newly renovated homes. The Great Depression is interesting for many reasons. Certainly, it's one of the bleakest periods of North American history, and that in and of itself makes it worth studying. It was also a crisis which exposed the essential polarization between rich and poor, men and women, white and racialized. What I find particularly interesting is the way these different polarizations changed and realigned themselves. The unemployed aligned together against the self-serving rich. But when the question of female workers was raised, suddenly you have men across many classes aligned against women. The same thing happened with the question of ethnicity. As the people who wrote to Prime Minister Bennett said, good Canadians deserved work, and good Canadians were described as white, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and French Canadians, the quote-unquote founding ethnicities. There was no mention of Aboriginal people in this rhetoric. The point is, the divisions between men and women, white and racialized people, mitigated against the creation of a unified working class movement, which ultimately only served the interests of the ruling elite. Class loyalties divided women's groups, as middle-class women tended to agree with middle-class men that unemployed women should be excluded from relief. This lays bare the power of domestic ideology, which defined men as breadwinners and women as homemakers. The shackles of the cult of true womanhood have yet to fully break. This explains why efforts to help poor women usually focused on improving their skills as homemakers rather than improving their wages as workers. Unemployment relief worked on the assumption that women were supported by wage-earning husbands, fathers, or sons. North Americans did their best to survive the economic roller coaster, but they began to question their blind faith in a capitalist system that destroyed human beings in its uncontrolled drive to satisfy the laws of supply and demand. While North Americans voted for new parties and experimented with state intervention, their leaders rejected a total overhaul of either the political or economic system. Politicians hung on grimly, hoping the pendulum would swing back and the good times would return. The Depression exposed class and gender differences that had been easier to minimize in the better economic times of the 1920s. With the outbreak of the Second World War in September of 1939, the fragile unity of countries would again be tested. Well, congratulations, you survived your first online lesson. Don't forget to submit a tutorial question or to answer a tutorial question on the discussion boards. I'll see you next week.